intend to tie up Donald Trump in 2024 in a host of legal cases. What you see here is a sampling of them. Donald Trump has 4 different criminal investigations going on as we speak. He's got the classified document case down in Florida for Mar-a-Lago, classified documents. You all remember the raid.
You got the Georgia election investigation, which is the Fulton County DA, Fannie Willis, looking into what happened as far as votes in Georgia after the election.
You got the January 6th investigation under Jack Smith.
And then don't forget about Alvin Bragg here in New York City. A number of different, it's convoluted, but criminal. You mentioned 4 criminal, but there's one that's dominated headlines recently, which is the civil investigation, which is still ongoing.
Yeah, that's Letitia James in New York City. But she's not the only civil investigation going on. So while there's 4 criminal investigations,
the American regime's lawfare against political opponents, dissidents, and citizens. Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. We're broadcasting live on robmaness.com and at Rob Maness on Spaces, X Spaces simulcast, Getter, and at Facebook Live. So we're back, and we've got a great show today. Well, lawfare is an aggressive use of the judicial system, and it's used to suppress information, intimidate citizens, and interfere with legitimate public processes such as an election. The United States government is practicing it on steroids as we see the Department of Justice or Injustice continuously go after Donald Trump in the middle of his presidential campaign. It's so blatant that the special prosecutors openly trying to align trial dates with major primary dates. Not surprising, many of these so-called attorneys don't even know the Constitution they say that they're defending. DOJ isn't working alone, though. The Department of Homeland Security is actually practicing a form of lawfare against every American citizen by its abuse of immigration laws on the books to bring in millions of illegal aliens, destroying America's shared cultural values and burdening government assistance systems while not getting enough benefits to Americans in a timely manner, such as homeless veterans. Well, we're excited to have as our guest today, former U.S. Department of Justice Double Assistant Attorney General in the Trump administration and Center for Renewing America's Senior Fellow and Director of Litigation, Jeff Clark. Jeff, welcome to the Rob Maness Show, sir. It's good to have you with us.
Well, it's good to be with you, Colonel. And you could not have picked a more newsworthy, concentrated cycle to have scheduled me to come on by coincidence. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, better lucky than good any day, I say. So this has been a fortuitous scheduling moment, and I appreciate you giving us your time. I've actually been catching a little snippets of news throughout the day, and you're a busy man. Have you been able to get out of the chair and get some lunch?
I did actually have a very nice lunch today at one of my favorite places. So, but it has been a busy media day for me. I think that's because something like what happened in Colorado is in my sweet spot, right? It's complicated, it's juicy, and luckily I think there are enough commentators or showrunners out there who realize I can try to help people understand it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've covered a couple of episodes where the issue has been brought up about the Colorado case and the other cases to get Trump off the ballot using the 14th Amendment, Section 3. And one question that I have that keeps coming up over and over from us lay people that just read the Constitution, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, we're not attorneys, but I did take an oath to it, so I've read it. And Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says that Congress has the power to enforce the elements essentially in that amendment through legislation.
Yes.
How does that pertain to, and isn't there a case to be made that has not happened in the case of President Donald J. Trump?
Yes. So the 14th Amendment is, unique in that it kind of carries its own ability for Congress to pass new laws that then tie back into the 14th Amendment. Usually Congress, right, especially for the Bill of Rights provisions, right, there's not an equivalent to Section 5 of the 14th Amendment in the Bill of Rights. So Congress can create new statutes and they can create new causes of action right? But they're not specifically tied to particular amendments, right? Like it's not like there's a second amendment, section 2, that says, hey, Congress can basically write something about how you enforce gun rights. But for the 14th Amendment, there is that kind of provision. And, for instance, this is something you probably haven't thought about, but there's a whole vast body of law about 11th Amendment immunity, which is the immunity of states to be hauled into federal court. And that immunity cannot be set aside if Congress is regulating under the Commerce Clause, because the 11th Amendment, being even after the Bill of Rights, came after the Commerce Clause in the main body of the Constitution. But Section 14, Section 5 legislation can override state sovereign immunity under the 11th Amendment. So it's a very unique power. And here, Congress, if they've used it at all, they used it only to adopt a criminal statute that makes insurrection a crime. But what we know is that President Trump has never been charged with that crime, let alone convicted of that crime. And for that reason, it violates his due process rights for 4 justices. And wait till I tell you about the mechanism by which they did this. It even, exacerbates the due process problem. But just on their own say-so, 4 justices find that President Trump engaged in insurrection. No jury trial, no grand jury indictment before that, no criminal information, nothing like that. The whole criminal process totally ignored. Therefore, Congress's Section 5 enforcement powers have been ignored. And it's another way in which this Colorado decision is unconstitutional. But here's the even worse way in which due process has been violated. How did the 4 out of 7 Colorado Supreme Court justices purport to find that President Trump had engaged in insurrection, even assuming January 6th was an insurrection? That's another defense, right? There is, as I said earlier today, a couple of problems with this decision. But let's just say arguendo, for the sake of argument, that there was an insurrection on January 6th. What's the evidence that President Trump engaged in it? All they come up with is they cite to the January 6th report. And they say, and you might say to yourself, well, why isn't that hearsay? Well, it is hearsay. There's an exception to hearsay for official government reports, right? But the U.S. Supreme Court has created a test for that. And that test has now been received into Colorado law by the Colorado Supreme Court. And it's clear that the January 6th committee report totally flunks that. The main reason is that it's biased. It's a total anti-Trump hit job by people who voted to impeach President Trump in the House, right? And then it went to the Senate where he was acquitted. That really also should be the end of this matter. Right. The fact that he was acquitted in the Senate, that's one of the reasons in the cornucopia as to why this is a crazy decision. But, as I gave as an example, right? Let's say, I don't know, you were fighting about like a TV license or something, right? Just as a contract matter. Mm-hmm. But there were some findings in an official report by the FCC about the nature of that license. You could potentially submit as an exception to hearsay that FCC report, right? Because it's not biased in favor of any particular party, right? It's just sort of describing the license. But to try to say that this hatchet job by Benny Thompson and his crew and Liz Cheney, the Trump hater, and Adam Kinzinger, the sort of mental lightweight, that is an unbiased government report is the most ridiculous thing you can imagine, especially because none of President Trump's lawyers could cross-examine any of the witnesses. There were no Republican members, and therefore, who were selected by the conference, and therefore no Republican lawyers, no minority counsel who could cross-examine the witnesses in closed-door, star chamber-like depositions. So it's a mockery of due process. It's completely violated President Trump's due process rights. And that's about, 4 or 5 different fruits that fit into the cornucopia as to why this is a utterly corrupt and baseless decision.
Yeah, I think a lot of people on the side that I'm on, and that you're on, the side that says, let the electorate make the decisions in this, are still in a state of disbelief. You mentioned the impeachment acquittal on this issue, right? I mean, technically, it was on this issue of insurrection.
Yes.
And, does that fit into now? Congress spoke, on that by acquitting the president. Does that fit into the Section 5 piece of the 14th Amendment
I
in the
think
enforcement part?
I think that's very astute of you to ask, Colonel, and I believe it does. There's a paper that I'd like to send your viewers and listeners to that is on the Citizens for Renewing America website that I wrote about the 14th Amendment, Section 5
Mhm.
issues, and Section 3 attack on President Trump. And, it sets out two theories. One of them is the one that you've just touched on, that the second impeachment at the start of 2021, which was done without any House inquiry, right? And so then you
Mhm.
wonder, why do House Republicans need a special pre-inquiry stage for President Biden? But the Democrats have already burned through that bridge. But they impeached him, and there was one impeachment article, and that one impeachment article was that President Trump had engaged in insurrection on January 6th, or he had provided aid and comfort to the insurrectionists. That was their article. It
Mhm.
failed. It didn't get the requisite supermajority in the Senate. And I think that is, and President Trump has argued that is double jeopardy, or, res judicata, depending on how you kind of look at the nature of the impeachment proceeding. It is a trial-like procedure, right? There's a trial in the Senate. There were prosecutors from the House who prosecuted that case, and then President Trump's lawyers went up to defend. And this is precisely why the Supreme Court set up the impeachment process and the trial process to require the Chief Justice of the United States to appear at the trial and preside over it, right? Now,
Right.
Chief Justice Roberts didn't do that here for the second impeachment. I submit because he knew that the second impeachment was totally beyond the Senate and the House's power, because it was the first impeachment ever of someone of a president after they'd left office, right? So what did they do? They just came up with an ersatz presider, since they didn't have the Chief Justice. They came up with Patrick Leahy, the senator. They said he was the presider. He was making the balls and strikes on evidence admission and the like, right? So once that acquittal occurred, I think that had the effect of blotting out this theory. So the whole January 6th committee, the whole process of bringing a January 6th case, like in federal court in D.C., like Jack Smith has brought, all these things are essentially second, third bites at the apple. And that's another reason why the Colorado Supreme Court is all wet here, because they're purporting to make their own decision. Like they don't get a vote in the Senate trial process, Colonel.
Right.
So their votes are irrelevant. And the fact that they think there was an insurrection and that they think that Donald Trump participated in it, no one should give two wits about.
Yeah, I told my audience when the lower judge slipped in her decision that that the evidence showed that he had committed insurrection, that was going to be a problem later on, and that they would hang their hat on that if they got a chance to. It looks like that's what the Colorado Supreme Court did. Uh, Lawyers, attorneys like you use a phrase, fruit of the poisonous tree, right? Or fruit of the poisonous root, or root of the poisonous tree. All of that stems back to that report in the J6 committee report. Is that what you're alluding to? Is that this decision being based on that, and the lack of due process and those kind of things?
Yes, I mean that at a 40,000-foot level, that's a good analogy. I mean, in the law, right, when you talk about the fruit of the poisonous tree, it's really a Fourth Amendment thing that, if there's been a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights with an invalid search or seizure, or warrant wasn't properly issued, then what they find in the warrant can be excluded as the fruit of the poisonous tree of the defective warrant or the defective authorization. But it's similar here, right? In that you cannot use a government report that has no indicia of reliability because it is a political document, not a quasi judicial document, and
Mhm.
then say that can kind of sub in for due process, right? Like even if the NTSB, right, the National Transportation Safety Board, they do like an inquiry about why did an air crash or a train crash occur, right?
Mhm.
They will bring in witnesses, right? They'll hear from them, and they could be represented by counsel, and they will make points on both sides. And the members of the board might disagree with each other, right? Like this was set up as a Nancy Pelosi one-way railroad job monolith, and it cannot possibly be taken as providing due process.
Absolutely. Well, let's go over to the Spaces Live audience and take a question, because I know they have questions. I spent some time with the audience before the show, as you heard. So Kat, Shell, whoever's got a question for Jeff over there on this, especially this Colorado issue, fire away.
I'm going to ask something real quick, and then I'll get to Wib if we have a chance. And now Fred. I had my hand up and I wasn't going to do it, but hey, Jeff, I already saw a story about Lieutenant Governor of California is already coming in lockstep with Colorado and rushing a case to try to remove him off California's ballot, which I fully expected to see in blue states. Obviously, they're going to all try to rush to do this. I'm going to ask you straight up, like, do you think he's got a good chance of getting this overturned at the Supreme Court level? Because I'm afraid that people are just like thinking it's a slam dunk. And right now, with the tone and tenor, I'm just a little bit nervous about it. I just wonder what your take was.
Sure. So look, I think that this decision is an abomination. It should be quickly reversed. Maybe not for purposes of your spaces questioners. At some point, Colonel, maybe you could ask me about how this weird stay was put in place by the Colorado Supreme Court, because that relates to this. But let me try to stick to something that's more understandable for this purpose and say, look, you can never count chickens, especially not with the Supreme Court when you got 9 very independently minded people. I think the liberals on the Supreme Court tend to more often vote as a block, but not entirely. Sometimes there are very weird constellations of justices depending on how things strike them. So I think, though, that they're going to want to take this case because, I think they're going to want to put themselves in the posture where the American people are the choosers of who becomes the next president. I think one reason why they shied away from taking any election cases in 2020 was because they had seen the massive blowback on the left and in the law professoriate in 2000 after Bush v. Gore of, you guys shouldn't be deciding presidential elections. You should have gotten out of the way, et cetera, et cetera. Al Gore otherwise would have been president. I don't buy those arguments. And I think the Supreme Court did the right thing in Bush versus Gore. But I think that we have a Supreme Court that especially under Chief Justice Roberts' leadership, seems to think that it should try to not wade into some of these controversies. But I think that here, if you have a state Supreme Court, right, and then the potential for 49 other state Supreme Courts, right, to start deciding for themselves to throw candidates of one party or the other off the ballot, like this is something that unravels and could pull down the whole system. I think they'll see that the implications of this are important enough that they should stop this. And then when I explain the stay, then you'll realize that maybe that'll make you a little more optimistic. So I'll give that as a teaser.
Yeah, one more question, Kat.
Go ahead, Whip.
Hey, Colonel, you and I have discussed this before a few months back, but I'd like to hear Jeff's take on whether or not the 14th Amendment, Section 3, even applies to somebody that's the president of the United States and has only ever been the president of the United States. He hasn't been a congressman or a senator or any other officer of the court, since the president isn't technically an officer.
Yeah, great question.
Yes. Yeah. So I had adverted to my paper, which again is up on the Citizens for Renewing America website. So if you Google my name, 14th Amendment, Citizens Renewing America, you should pop it up pretty easily. I mentioned the second point in the paper is the one you started with, Colonel, about the fact that the second impeachment failed. The first point in the paper is the one that the caller has just raised, which is that the office of the president is not listed on the offices to which you're disqualified from potentially if all the other parts of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment can be met. So I described this actually earlier today. There's a list, okay, and the list proceeds in hierarchical order. It's not something that is a random thing, right? It starts with senators, then it goes to congressmen. You get the mention explicitly of electors of the president and vice president, right?
Mhm.
But curiously, not the office of the president or the vice president themselves. And then you get into other officers. So this actually lets me do a little bit of Latin. So, we can have, Colonel Maness, law school class a little bit here. So there are, two principles of interpreting statutes that are often invoked when you're dealing with lists, especially one of the two I'm going to describe. There's a Latin canon, nostitur a socius, which basically means words are known by the company they keep. And the other canon is a justem generis, of a like kind. So the second one is especially relevant. Sometimes they're conflated, but the second one's especially relevant because if you have a list of offices, right, you can infer something from the list. So whenever I watch CNN or MSNBC, what I see them doing is they will say, well, it's a no-brainer that the 14th Amendment, Section 3 applies to block Trump if it's found that he engaged in an insurrection, which, of course, they've been promoting nonstop since January 6th, like including on that very day. The talking points went out. That's the narrative. That's what they maintain, because it says that it applies, basically to any officer. But that's the last item on the list. And what the canon does is it tells you what, it helps to confine what is on the list. And so if you're dealing with a hierarchical list, it gives you the idea of, look, what's in that category at the end, the catch-all category about officers in the United States, wasn't a backdoor secret way to sneak in the president, who they didn't mention, even though they mentioned electors for the president explicitly. Right. It's a way to capture the officers who are beneath those who are already listed. And I think that's just like the most elementary way to read it for anyone who's studied statutory interpretation, which for law students sometimes takes, the 2L year or the 3L year. It's often not a first year law school proposition, but people who at least are going to be litigators study that, take that class. It's even good for transactional lawyers because they got to read a lot of contracts and things. So the mainstream leftist media, the hacks who attack in lawfare. I've coined this term now, Colonel, called journo lawfare, where we have these former leftist prosecutors who are constantly on, promoting all of the lawfare against President Trump.
I'm writing that down.
They just I do it on my Twitter feed as journo lawfare trademarked. So, they do this constantly, and they will just, boil down. They won't show the text of the 14th Amendment, Section 3. They just boil it down to, it says any officer, it's a no-brainer. President Trump is an officer, right? Now, even at that level, as the questioner mentioned, there are Supreme Court cases that hold in various areas that the president is actually not, an officer of the United States for certain purposes, right? And the response to that from sort of the Larry Tribes of the world, emeritus professor at Harvard, and Judge Ludig, who seems to have completely flipped his mind in recent years and become, Trump deranged, is, well, there are references to the office of the presidency. Yes, but it's a unique office. And especially if you interpret the list in the 14th Amendment, Section 3, in the way I've described, using the canons of interpretation, you can't remotely come to the conclusion that the president was supposed to fit into that catch-all box.
Absolutely. That's exactly, from a common sense perspective, and somebody that's operated in the government for decades of my life and read a lot of legalese and all that. When I read that section, that's how I interpret it. It's a hierarchical list, and the office of the president of the United States is not an officer of the United States. As a matter of fact, officers of the United States all stem from that office at the pleasure of the president. When you're talking about commissioned officers and warrant officers and those kind of things in the United States of America. Well, before we leave the Colorado subject, let me ask you about that unique stay, Jeff, because it was unique. And I want the audience to hear it from you. Why I thought it was odd when I read it.
It is odd. Yeah,
that's
I've never seen the likes of it before, and I think it was done for strategic political purposes. So let me just deal with like a baseline thing. It's been reported, right, that this decision was self-stayed by the Colorado Supreme Court for until January 4th. But it's actually more complicated than that. So I have the text here, if you'll give me a chance to read it. So
Sure.
it says, if review is sought in the Supreme Court before the stay expires on January 4th, then the stay shall remain in place and the Secretary will continue to be required to include President Trump's name on the 2024 presidential ballot until the receipt of any order or mandate from the Supreme Court. So, you should go, I think it's on page 10 of 213 of the opinion. You can go look at it yourself. But what they're saying is that even if you just if President Trump just seeks a stay, right, then the stay continues past January 4th. Now you have to use some external logic, because what I understand the Colorado Secretary of State has said is that for purposes of the Republican primary ballot, they need to know by January 5th whether President Trump's going to be on it or not, right? Because there's a whole administrative process. You got to print things up and the like, or I guess these days enter it into a computer system. And so if it's clear that if President Trump seeks cert on, say, January 4th, right, he's sought it, so then the stay will not lapse, okay?
Right.
And that means, under the administrative point I'm making about like when they print the ballots or prepare them electronically, however they do it, that his name will be on the ballot. So it's almost like the seeking of review arguably self-moots the case, right? Because how's the Supreme Court like that? If I were a Supreme Court justice, I'd be saying to myself, well, he's going to be on the ballot because we were told that was the only thing that could happen. Maybe that, Colorado Secretary of State will come screaming in and saying like, oh, I've developed an emergency process where I can remove him now, right? So they could try to avoid that.
Sure.
But, otherwise it just seems like it's been set up to be self-mooted. And if you wanted this to have effect, why would you do anything like that? Why wouldn't you just say, we'll self-stay till January 4th. Then, we're going to do what we say we're going to do in this opinion, unless the Supreme Court orders us to stop. That's an ordinary stay. This is the weirdest stay I've ever seen. And my answer to my own question about why did they do it this way is because I think they realize that like one way or another, this thing is not going to really go into effect. So they're just making a bold political statement. They're dominating the news cycle and they're dirtying up President Trump. That's what they're up to. That is fundamentally illegitimate. It's not the judicial role. It's not judges acting according to their oath to the U.S. Constitution or to the state constitution.
Yeah, and as an American citizen, a layperson, an officer of the United States, because I still have my commission, it's still good. I'm embarrassed because the judicial system in this country is the crown jewel of what makes America America, in my opinion. And I don't say that lightly. So it's very concerning that 4 judges that had esteemed backgrounds and long careers would take a step like this into partisan political arena in the middle of a presidential election.
Yeah, I think 2 things to understand. One is it just seems like a lot of people really, on the left, or some even, people who are kind of centrist types, that Donald Trump seems to have make them, lose their minds. Like I can't explain some of the things they do or say on television or in print or elsewhere, except that they've worked themselves into some kind of artificial panic and frenzy. They can't even understand when, President Trump is asked by, Sean Hannity, will you be a dictator? And he's like, just on day one, right? Like, and then it just shows that they're not tracking the play. But the second thing, Colonel, is that I don't think people realize how far gone the law schools are. So since, early in the 20th century, they've been teaching this very destructive school of jurisprudence called legal realism. And legal realism basically argues, as a boil down for your viewers and listeners, that the judges are just politicians in robes, and whatever they say about complicated doctrines, that some of them, right, the most radical of them would be side by side by me and saying like, you don't really believe that old Latin maxims decide cases like justem generis, right? Like that's all just smoke and mirrors. Because Clark's a Republican, and he, and then if he or others are on the bench and they use those things, it's just disguised politics. Right. Like, no, that's not what the law is. it's what it's been perverted into by these people. And because they bought into this very destructive jurisprudential school of thought, legal realism, or then there's even Marxism come to law, it's called critical legal studies, they actually think that the ends justify the means. And that now that they wear the black robes, they can be the ones who just use some legal mumbo jumbo to get to the results they want. And it's destructive of the republic and of our, our whole civic order.
And that's the danger of Ketanji Jackson sitting on the Supreme Court right there, in my opinion. Well, I want to get to a couple more cases because one of the ones that may come up to the Supreme Court, they're at least going to hear some arguments, I believe, is about immunity. But I want to play this clip that you did a long post on X about with this clown who I think is an AUSA or was a former government federal lawyer, but he's confused about the co-equal branches of governments and whether the Supreme Court is supreme or what over the presidency. Watch this.
Supreme Court, not inferior to the president, but supreme to the president. They're the last stop on, saying what is and is not legal, what is and is not constitutional. If a president gets to commit crimes with impunity, they have now elevated him to being above the Supreme Court. They're not going to do it. They love their supreme power, don't they? In fact, if they said a president can commit any and all crimes in office with complete protection against prosecution, Donald Trump could simply order the Supreme Court disbanded. Sure, that might constitute any number of crimes, but if the Supreme Court says that's good to go, are you telling me Donald Trump wouldn't try to dismantle the branch of government that is actually supreme to him? Or maybe he would just invite the Supreme Court justices he doesn't like to see him out on Fifth Avenue.
Well, that's clown, former AUSA, I believe, Glenn Kirshner, who doesn't have a clue as to the co-equal branches of government, and really is suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. There, this man, Donald J. Trump, is going to, try to hurt somebody, have somebody killed, or whatever. That's the reference to Fifth Avenue from his first campaign.
Yeah, no, it's absurd. I think maybe the first part of that got a little cut off. So within like one breath, like within 10 seconds, he says that the three branches are co-equal. Now that's correct. Then he says that the Supreme Court is supreme to President Trump or to any president, right? And they could tell them what to do. Now the Supreme Court, so this is a very complicated topic. And actually one of the professors who's written most importantly, incisively on this is Michael Stokes Paulson, about the fact that if you do have a co-equal set of branches of government, right, you have situations where the president can disagree with the Supreme Court and say, well, that's your reading of the Constitution, but I disagree. And then Congress can disagree, right? Yeah. What is true about the Supreme Court is that if it takes a particular case or controversy, then it can issue an order in that case that is final, okay? But that's not to elevate them to a process where they are, like Animal Farm, the branch that is more equal than others, right? It's just a function of the fact that that's the judicial power, is to rule in cases or controversies. This is the kind of thing where like Glenn Kirshner is way out of his depth. He doesn't understand the first thing about these things. And what's scary about the fact that he doesn't really understand the structure of the Constitution, how that is very important to how it's interpreted, how our three branches really work, right? This guy was in charge really of capital crimes in DC at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, it's a sort of unique fusion of the local, because DC is not a state, right? It's a unique federal enclave, the seat of the federal government, and purely federal crimes, right? So if you're charged under 18 U.S.C., where most of the U.S. criminal code provisions are, the U.S. Attorney's Office, in DC prosecutes that. But if there's a local law that's adopted under the DC law, local criminal law, like, don't steal from the local grocery store, right? And punishing that. The U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. also does those local crimes, whereas if you're in any other place in the country, a state or local prosecutor would do those kinds of crimes. So he did both. But if you committed murder or something, whether it's a federal crime, they're rare cases like that, or more often than not, like a local murder where you just engaged in it because you hated somebody or for profit or drugs or something like that. He was like the chief prosecutor of that. So it's really alarming. Yeah, it's really alarming that someone cannot understand, the theory of the Constitution. Like, I suspect like he hasn't even read a word of the Federalist Papers, and if it did, it was like matter and antimatter, and his brain exploded.
And what's got him riled up is the potential for this presidential immunity question to be taken up by the court. If I understood it correctly, do you think they will take that up ultimately after they hear the briefs that they've asked for?
I think they will. I think it's trending in that direction. Let's say that, but I actually don't think they should take it. Right, and the reason is because Jack Smith has filed a unique. It's not unique. It's just a less well-known, less well-used provision over time in history. It's called cert before judgment, certiorari before judgment. Usually, you can only seek certiorari, which is a request. Most of the Supreme Court's docket is discretionary. They decide what cases to take, and that's what a writ of certiorari does. Like, it lets them parse out what they're going to take and what they're not going to take. If they grant the writ, they take the case. If they deny the writ, they don't take the case. So here, usually you can only get cert after there is a final judgment from the Court of Appeals. And the cert before judgment mechanism lets the Supreme Court skip over the intermediate step of here the DC Circuit, the DC Court of Appeals. And the issue is, can the showing to be done to allow that to be done, can it be made? And the main reason why Jack Smith is asking for this is he's basically positing the March 4th trial date that Judge Chutkan set in the so-called January 6th case against President Trump as, sort of like an immovable object that cannot be changed. And that if that trial date's going to be maintained, you have to grant cert before judgment. I submit that that's hogwash. Like, that's an arbitrary date that Judge Chutkan picked. She could have picked a later date, but she didn't. And yeah, she has discretion to fix her own docket, set her own docket, and pick a trial date. But that's not something that once she picks it, that gives the special prosecutor here the option to immediately get cert before judgment review by the Supreme Court. What is the real thing that's driving this? The real thing that's driving this is they want that trial so that they can hurt President Trump in the primary processes, right? That's why they want this, or to stop him from getting reelected again in the general election. And so if the trial gets delayed past March 4th, it's Judge Cannon with the documents case in Florida. She's kind of occupied the middle of the chessboard, right? Doesn't get out of the way. Then Judge Chutkan's got to start looking at dates after that. And then when you start looking at dates after that, it really looks like election interference, right? The summer before the election, while the conventions are going on, she's going to be holding a trial then. Like, that's pretty serious intervention into the process. So then potentially you may have to wait until after the election. And if President Trump gets reelected, right, then they know that he could pardon himself, and then the whole thing gets mooted. Or even if he doesn't pardon himself, right, a president can't be tried while in office. He could put it off until 2029. And so 2029. The election would be 2028, and then January 20th, 2029 would be the inauguration of the new president. That's what's really driving this. And Jack Smith cannot say that out loud. He can't say the quiet part out loud and say, well, this is all about political interference, therefore I got to keep my trial date. Don't you understand? I think that the left on the court, justices on the court, they understand that that's what this is about, right? But you even had Ellie Honig, right, who's a left-wing commentator, one of these, prosecutor guys doing journal lawfare on CNN with Michael Smerconish, admitting that's really the game here, right? I was actually, put one in Ellie Honig's column, right? Like, Glenn Kirshner would never admit something like that, but Honig is at least objective enough to realize and say, like, that's the game that's going on. It's just so everybody knows.
Oh, it certainly is. I mean, Smith's even appears to be disobeying check and stay on all the deliverables over the last couple of days, and on Cannon's too, because Cannon has stayed the procedural deliverables and everything until they see what's going on with the January 6th trial. So it's very interesting what's going on. It's also another indicator that the judicial system and the justice system are really have been very politicized. The average citizen's take on it is exactly that, Jeff. Well, what about? Let me go to the audience. I got a hand up over here real quick for a question, and then I want to talk about the obstruction of an official proceeding appeal that they're going to take up. Go ahead over there, Kat and Shell, with whoever's got their hand up.
Go ahead, Fred.
Good afternoon, Colonel and Jeff. Jeff, I just wanted to know, I know we can't really look into these people's minds, but how can they be so smart on one hand and so dumb on the other when he quotes this stuff? Is it intentional just to excite people? And another thing is, if the Supreme Court is apt to pick this case up, do you think they'll rule broadly where this can't be reinstituted by another state?
So I think that that's one reason why they should take this, even given the weird, self-mooting stay process that the Colorado Supreme Court tried to put in there, because you just can't have a system where you have 50 different states having 50 different ballots, right? It negates the whole idea of having a national election. And so, one of the main features of the Supreme Court is that it's designed to ensure uniformity of federal law, right? They can't contradict the Colorado Supreme Court on Colorado state law. And there were significant Colorado state law issues that actually occupied 2 of the 3 dissents in this case, too, and then obviously, of course, occupies part of the majority opinion. The Supreme Court can't take those, but what it can do is take and provide uniformity on federal law questions. And I think they should do that, because we don't want to have a situation where there's like a new Supreme Court case related to some new state Supreme Court case that tries to kick Trump off the ballot every month or so. I mean, that's like chaos. So this is one where there is an objective basis to take it and decide it early. Whereas I think the March 4th trial date is just an arbitrary date. It's like a date you could throw a dart at a dartboard and like pick a calendar, pick a date, right? That can't be some kind of like immovable anchor point that dictates how the Supreme Court proceeds. But if you're in this risk of having a balkanized system where like you have 50 different ballots, that's chaos. I think the Supreme Court has to step in. And I think, caller, that I missed the first part of your question. I think you had a slightly different first part of your question.
Fred, did you get it?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Well, I was going to say with this ADA on the network, when he has a complete different take or not educated take, how can someone be so smart and so stupid in the same sentence? So is this intentional just to incite people against Trump, or is he? And I know we can't look into his mind, but what is your take on that?
So I think that he is smarter than some of the journo lawfare practitioners, and he knows what he knows, right? He teaches criminal law, maybe criminal process as well, at GW Law School here in the district. So he does know those things well. He gives little tutorials to people. He's always spinning it in a mega anti-Trump direction, right? But there are certain things, like when he starts talking about jurisdictional issues, when he talks about removal to federal court issues, when he talks about the Constitution structure, right? Like he just has never had to deal with those things. And actually, I'm sorry to report to you, having, been at Main Justice in 2 different stints, one in the Trump administration and one in the Bush 43 administration, that in my dealings with assistant U.S. attorneys, I find that they know the criminal code, the federal criminal code well. They can know Supreme Court case law about criminal law particularly well. But if you start talking about general constitutional restrictions, the structure of the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, like they're kind of out of their depth. I think Ellie Honig is more objective. I'll give you another example of someone who's not a lawyer, right? Who I caught recently on something silly where Lawrence O'Donnell was saying that the FCC has no jurisdiction over cable television, and so I just sent him like, here's the FCC's page where they link all the regulations that relate to cable television. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. And he never responded on the merits. He's just like, come on my show and debate me, right? Where I would not have a debate about FCC regulation of television. I would have a debate about him attempting to bring me down and wage the journo lawfare against me directly. So he's dim. He's at the dim end of the spectrum, right? Glenn Kirshner, I put like a little more past the center part of the spectrum to educated, but they're kind of black holes in his legal knowledge where he's out of his depth.
And Jeff, as we move into this, what I want to ask you about this obstruction of official proceeding law, 1512, I think it's called. Is there just an army of lawyers in the federal government right now that are willing to try any novel legal theory? Because that's what this obstruction of official proceeding, to my mind and to my viewers, and none of us are attorneys, we're just citizens that are concerned and watching this stuff. That it's a very nefarious effort, just focused at taking down one man's opportunity to get back into power who represents us.
Right. I think that's right. And then on the obstruction of official proceeding, this is 18 USC 1512 C2. It was adopted in the wake of the Enron scandal with Arthur Anderson kind of destroying documents. So, allegedly, on behalf of Enron. And, that was seen as a loophole, sort of going after them, right? The documents weren't being destroyed by Enron directly. And so they created this new crime, which talks about otherwise obstructing an official proceeding after it talks about, blocking witnesses, maybe threatening them or destroying documents, right? So again, it's the same thing. You got a list, and the list should be understood to relate back to the character of what it is you start with, which are things that relate to evidence gathering, right? That's what obstruction of justice is about. It's historically what it's always been about.
Right.
Other canons come into play here too to reach the same outcome that the statute doesn't apply. Namely, you have to have fair notice of a criminal statute. What does it mean? That what does it actually prohibit? What does the ordinary person look at and think this would prohibit? And historically, looking at obstruction of justice, you would never think it would apply to going to vent your First Amendment rights up at the Capitol. And then there's yet another canon. There's a canon called the rule of lenity, which is even if you were in a situation where a criminal law is ambiguous, you should be saying, well, then it doesn't. If it's applied to this situation and it's ambiguous whether it does or not, then don't apply it, right? Like you got to give people the fair notice. So rewrite the statute to make it clear. You're right, Colonel. It looks like there are people who are just, and it goes back to this like pernicious legal realism idea. They're just like, they want to nail Trumpers or President Trump. And so they just go back and they start scouring the code. And somebody looked at this and they're like, Eureka, I can use this because I can just ignore all the context and I can just say that, there was a January 6th certification process. The people, or maybe some of them, wanted to aim to obstruct that. Therefore, it's an obstruction of an official proceeding. And we know that were the interpretation of obstruction of an official proceeding, why didn't they prosecute the protesters against Justice Kavanaugh, right? Why didn't they prosecute Linda Sarsour, who was just at the Capitol complaining about Palestine and the war with Israel, right? Mm-hmm. Then that's also selectively applied. Like it's another cornucopia of legal problems with this obstruction statute. And I think the Supreme Court took that case. It's called the Fisher case. I think they took that case to reverse.
Now, what happens to two of the charges that Trump is faced with under Jack Smith's prosecution on the January 6th trial are related to that, aren't they? What happens with
Yes.
that whole case
It,
if they reverse
if the Supreme Court reverses and says that 1512 doesn't apply in this circumstance, right, then they don't even have to say anything directly about President Trump's case, right?
that?
That will
Right.
become the precedent, the national precedent. President Trump's lawyers will go to Judge Chuckett and say, like, these charges got to be dismissed, Your Honor, right? And then I think that guts the case, because I think
Yeah.
everything ties to this narrative, this theory that President Trump ginned up January 6th. Then he riled up the crowd once they arrived, right? Like there's the original text message. Glenn Kirshner, to mention him, plays it all the time of, I think the anniversary, 3-year anniversary of that text of come to DC, be there, be wild, was yesterday.
Yeah.
And so they say that's the ginning of it up, right? It's like pre-meditation. Then
Yeah.
he gave the speech urging violence on January 6th. Then the violence happened. Then he sat in the dining room off the Oval Office and he did nothing, violating his take care clause duties, right? This is their whole theory. So if they can't, use the hammer of this obstruction of an official proceeding statute, right, it really kind of pulls the guts out of their own case. And, I think that a fair judge would entertain a motion to dismiss the whole thing and kind of send them back to the drawing board. But, it remains to be seen what will actually happen if the Supreme Court reaches that result in Fisher.
Yeah, it's a crapshoot, as they say. Lawfare against Donald Trump and his supporters specifically is just one part of the lawfare, Jeff. I'm going to take one more question from the audience, and then I want to show a little clip from Eagle Pass, Texas, and talk about the lawfare that DHS is practicing on all American citizens that I mentioned in my opening. Go ahead, Kat. I think Truth's got a question there.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, great space. Caught the tail end of it, Colonel. But, I was just over at Mario's space. And, the normie folks justifying the actions of the left. I'm wondering if anyone else is seeing it, including DeSantis supporters. No surprise. But their justification is this. It's no big deal. It's a stay till the 4th of January. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the ruling by 6 Republicans and 2 Dems, I'm hearing. I haven't vetted that, but digressing. They're just saying, it's a simple matter of the law. And to the speaker's point, yes, J6 is being used. We're not hearing anything about 2020, the summer of rage, the $2 billion worth of damages, etc. Never applies to them. But we're actually being told, just relax. This is just part of the process.
Yep.
At the Supreme Court, if they pass the decision that it's within the right of Colorado, we should support it. If they don't, they're willing to support that too. Isn't that something? Now it's all following the letter of the law.
Sure.
Crazy.
I think Jeff's answered a little bit of that already.
Yeah, I'll observe to that of, just be still, lamb, while we, slit your throat. Or Samson, goes to sleep and Delilah cuts his hair off, right? And he wakes up and he's like, wow, I don't have any power anymore. I shouldn't have, disobeyed. Look, we have a constitution that, yes, it has a process. It has a process that includes the Supreme Court, but we were never intended to be ruled by the Supreme Court. We are a free people, and that's why the Constitution begins with the words "we the people," right? And so we need to demand our ability to seek to vote in free and fair elections for the president of our choosing. And the Supreme Court has all kinds of doctrines that recognize the validity of kind of not interfering with democratic processes and realizing that courts are inherently restricted in their powers. It's why the framers called it the least dangerous branch, right? It has neither force nor will, but only judgment. So force is in the executive branch, and Colonel, you're part of that force, even still with your commission. And will is Congress, passing laws to create the will to devise new mechanisms and make things illegal or legal. And then you have, the Supreme Court. They're just exercising judgment, trying to call balls and strikes. But if you don't realize that this case is unique in the history of our country, it represents a dangerous threat of lawfare that threatens our liberty and the very nature of the republic, then you're asleep. This isn't something where, the Supreme Court's deciding what, Section 111.2 B Romanet 5 means as to, what your obligation is in terms of, registering a drone, right? Like this is an earth-shattering constitutional case. And it's not something where you just go to sleep and say, I've offloaded that to the Supreme Court. They can decide that. However they come out, I'll be happy. That shouldn't be your attitude.
My answer to those people that have that attitude, Greg, is be better citizens. Come on, man.
Exactly.
Be better citizens. It's a citizens' government, and we need to insist that we have the power and that we use our power appropriately within the system. Well, let me show this video clip from Eagle Pass, Texas, real quick, Jeff, because I want to get your take on how the government is using lawfare against us on behalf of illegal aliens.
It's the 18th of December. We're out here at the point of entry. 5,000 are sitting on the ground right now. It's increasing as we go along. Information that we've received says another 7,000 should be processed through this particular point by morning. Joe and I have been here many times. Last time we were down here, we were in uniform, and now I'm a civilian and in the Army of God. So we'll keep telling truths, and you need to get this video to your legislators and tell them, in the state of Texas particularly, this is out of control. Thank you very much. Doc Chambers from Eagle Pass, Texas.
That was Doc Chambers, Eagle Pass, Texas, as you just heard him say there, from 2 days ago. And I saw a tweet just before we came on from Michael Yon that said there were at least 8,000 or 9,000 more there since that video was shot. Over 12,000 people that are in that area. And when you look at the video, you see soldiers, Customs and Border Patrol, and they're facilitating things. They're not stopping anything. And it just amazes me. And I wanted to get your take on this because I know you guys at Center for Renewing America talk about it a lot. Is what can we as citizens, what should we be doing and looking for to try to put a stop to this and hold the government officials from the president on down accountable for not executing the laws of the land properly? Because that's what's really happening.
Right. So let me put it into two categories. First is this is clearly an organized invasion coming across our southern border. And we have two organizations and they each have their own website. So I mentioned the Citizens site, that's where the 14th Amendment paper is. But we also have the Center for Renewing America site, americarenewing.com. On that site, you can find several papers about the invasion of the southern border and why, in something that's sometimes called the self-help provision of the Constitution, the border states like Texas and Arizona can actually repel that invasion because the federal government is not doing its job to do that. And this is a very organized process. NGOs and international NGOs and, Soros money, et cetera, are being used to bring these people up. They've created an entire pipeline. And then, they support the people, the government supporting them, putting on planes. I sat next to, a young mother and her child, and, I felt for them at a human level. But on the other hand, right, like I kind of got, particularly since the government took my phone, Colonel, I have a sort of lesser generation iPhone, and I'm looking at them, both of them with brand new iPhones provided by the government, right? And so, they're misusing the asylum laws of the United States, right? If you're a former Soviet dissident or something, that's kind of what the asylum laws are for. Or if you're a people group that, is kind of narrow and insular, as the Supreme Court sometimes uses that term, that they could say if they were being persecuted in their home country because they were a minority there, that they need asylum for that reason, right? But it's not designed to just be like, come one, come all. Like, we're richer here in the US and we have a big public welfare system and you can get on the dole here. That's not a proper reason for asylum. And they're just flooding the system, so because they know that there aren't enough immigration judges and the whole system's overwhelmed. They get, documents that say, come back for your immigration hearing, 5 years from now, right? So it's a joke. And then in terms of there's a whole lawfare component of this too. So when I was in the Trump administration, I had the pleasure or the burden of running two divisions that are the constant, sort of defending places for lawfare. One was the Environment Division. You can't do anything in the environmental area where, 10 NGOs, environmental NGOs, green groups show up and sue you to try to block it if you're trying to enforce the law, use the law properly, recognize its limits, and deregulate. Same thing in the immigration area. So when I took over the civil division, that's where immigration law is. You can't do anything like, a remain in Mexico process, try to do something about, this, family separation issue, try to do something about like people carrying diseases across the border. You do that, like you get sued by, a dozen NGOs, that do immigration work, and they're often represented by big law firms, where people are making a lot of money and the associates are making a lot of money pro bono, right? So you're just like, this isn't good for the country. So you got the lawfare element, you got the just disregard of the law and the oaths by the Biden administration officials. And so you need to urge your governors, if you're in border states, to take action under the self-help clause and repel the invasion. But I think that, the other main thing you need to do is you need to call on your members of the House to include in the impeachment process the total destruction of our border. And there need to be hearings about that. I think Mayorkas should be impeached as well for this derogation of duty. I think, you got to put on pressure wherever you can find it. And I think the main places you can put it on are in Congress in connection with impeachment and in your state, border state governments, Texas, Arizona, to repel the invasion.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jeff. We're out of time. Unfortunately, this was a very fast hour, and I do so appreciate your time. Tell folks where they can find you and Center for the Renewing America. It's critically important. I try to drive people to CRA's sites all the time because of the different policies, papers, and plans that are out there that folks that listen in this audience are supportive of. They need to know where they're at.
Sure. Well, thanks again, Colonel. So I am Jeff Clark US on X, Twitter, and Getter, and at Real Jeff Clark on Truth Social. The Center for Renewing America is americarenewing.com. And if I could, since I'm also personally being subjected to this lawfare, being seen as adjacent to President Trump, please consider a donation or sending a prayer through GiveSendGo. My site there is givesendgo.com/Jeff Clark, JEFFCLARK.
Well, this audience is very generous, sir, and we will certainly help you out. And we're not only that, but we're praying for you, and we support you. There are thousands of volunteers signing up for things like Project 2025 with the Heritage Foundation to volunteer for the next administration. And I think we'll have an army of America First types to help you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Colonel, and keep up the good work. You had a great show here.
Thank you, and God bless you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Well, that was former Deputy Attorney General Jeff Clark. Great man. As he mentioned, he is suffering from the lawfare personally himself. So go help him out at his Give Send Go. And this will be the last show of 2023 for the Rob Maness Show. We will be back in early January. And at the end of January, we'll be back on a network. We just confirmed it today. We'll be live 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern, with our X Spaces audience live once again. So I'm excited about that. if you get the video, the crawler's got all the promos on it. We've got promo codes Maness at faithandfreedoms.com, over at Matt Couch's site there at mypillow.com with Mike Lindell. Get your Christmas presents. And of course, beardvet.com, which is BeardVet coffee. And every time you make a purchase with BeardVet, they make a donation to a veterans charity. So check them out. It's right there. And you can follow us on all the social media. It's on the crawler if you get the video, and we'll get the video out for this show pretty quickly now. Until then, I'm Rob Maness. God bless you. Merry Christmas, and God bless America.